So why don't we just start with some context? What's going on in the larger war in the spring of '69?
And that's important because I think often when we have talked about this battle, it kind of just focuses on what happens in the Hill, and I think it's important to put it into that context, that broader understanding. This is the spring of 1969, so this is well into 3+ years of the American phase of the war, if you want to call it that. This is a moment when the American fighting strength in South Vietnam has reached its peak. So there's just under 545,000 military personnel that are in South Vietnam. Of those, the majority are Army, but again, you have all the service branches represented. This is also just about a year after the 1968 Tet Offensive, which again was an important moment in the war where the communists tried to achieve a quick victory, and that failed. So there's been over this past year the most intense fighting, and that's kind of important to keep in mind is the greatest number of casualties in a single year period have happened in the time leading up to the spring of 1969. Now, from the American point of view, they've got a couple things that they are having to keep foremost in mind. One of them is the possibility of beginning the withdrawal of American troops. Now, this has not been officially declared, and it hasn't been finalized, like how that will happen, at what time frame and what increments. But the broad consensus in the Nixon administration is yes, that's going to happen. And it's going to begin sometime later this year. So that is behind the scenes part of the thinking. So with that in mind, the American strategy, or the South Vietnamese strategy in the country, is going to be built upon whatever we can do to buy time for the South Vietnamese to get on their feet and be able to take the war over progressively to the point where it's mostly just South Vietnamese fighting. So these are the things we're thinking about in the spring of 1969. And that helps explain the context behind this battle, because one of the big problem areas throughout the war has been the this I Corps area. I Corps is the South Vietnamese tactical zone that encompasses the 5 northernmost provinces. And the two close to the demilitarized zone, Quang Tri and Trois Tien province, have always been amongst the most threatened because the communists can mass their forces there. So this has always been a problem area. And effectively, if we're going to buy time for the South Vietnamese, we need to make sure that those two provinces in particular are pretty locked down. So the thing that focuses most of the attention is this valley in the interior mountains called the A Shau Valley. And it has been the principal communist logistical area throughout the war for Northern I Corps. The material and troops that are coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos get stored at these various way stations called bin trons, and then they get moved over into South Vietnam, and many of them get concentrated in the A Shau Valley. Now, if the Allies don't shut down the A Shau Valley, then it will be possible for the communists to descend upon the coastal lowlands and potentially take over Hue or Da Nang or other big cities. That's why the A Shau Valley matters. We have to deny it to the communists. And so the operations that are planned in early 1969 in I Corps are designed to prevent the enemy from using this valley. So there's a series of operations that the Marines and the Army undertake to close down the valley. And by
Sorry, before we
yeah,
get
go
into
ahead.
but sorry to interrupt, but before we
Yeah,
get into the operations, which I definitely would like to do,
right.
uh, can you just describe the terrain a little
Oh
bit?
yeah. So these Northern I Corps, these two provinces, it's a relatively narrow section of land. Um, we're talking a on the coast, you have between 5 and 20 kilometers of lowlands, and then that goes up into pretty steep mountains. And those mountains continue for up to 90 kilometers to the Laotian border. And this is pretty rugged terrain. So these are jagged mountain peaks and ridges, which generally run from north to south. And this is important because there's only a few places where you can go east to west. Now, the Ashau Valley itself extends for, you know, depending on where you choose your starting point. I mean, it can be up to 30 kilometers from north to south. So it's a big, noticeable valley. And it's inside the border, and so it's a natural waypoint. And there's a couple places where you can cross the mountains from Laos into the Ashau Valley. There's no point; it's really easy, but there's a few places where it's easier.
Mhm.
And so the Ashau Valley is, again, far enough away from the lowlands that the communists can store and hide supplies, particularly when the weather is bad, which is a lot of the year. When the clouds come in, they can use that as concealment to hide their supplies. So this valley, like I said, it's a forbidding place. Uh, every veteran I've ever talked to who's been there said the hair stands up on their arms when they first saw it, and particularly by the spring of '69, the Allies had been operating in the valley on and off for over a year, and so it's cratered, from north to south because all the B-52 strikes and everything else. So it kind of has a little bit of the flavor of a World War I battlefield,
Hmm.
with all the bomb craters and everything else. In certain areas which have been sort of blasted clean with napalm, so you can sort of see the scarring of a year's battle. And again, it's pretty far away from the coastal lowlands. So once you get in there, I mean, you are really far away from any population. The only people you're likely to see there are, again, the North Vietnamese and the Americans. So in that sense, it's a conventional war. It's not like a bunch of hamlets and villages where you have to always, are those people friendly or not? No, it's just the two combatants. And like I said, this valley has a few places where you can cross over. Up to this point, the Allies have conducted a series of operations and have closed off most of those crossing points. So in April, May of '69, there's really only one part of the valley, the central part of the valley, the Allies have not closed off. And so this has been an ongoing thing that's taken over a year to do, many operations. And again, in the April and May of '69, the Allies are now saying, we have this opportunity to close off the last transit point from Laos into the Ashau Valley. And that's the context for what becomes this monumental battle.
Hmm. Yeah, so my understanding is that this wasn't like a huge, strategic initiative. This was, from what I understand, this was a fairly routine, if I could use that word, in terms of, what the 101st were doing there. They were basically looking for bad guys to clear out. It wasn't
Right.
necessarily the case that they thought that Hill 937 had any immediate or particular strategic value. It's just where they were looking
Yeah,
for.
not per se. I mean, in that sense, it was this specific operation was known as Apache Snow. And there had been operations, going back to 1968, the initial Operation Delaware, when the first Cav went into the valley, and there'd been operations after that, Somerset Plain and Massachusetts Striker, all these names. And these were the operations I mentioned where they'd been going to different parts of the valley, finding the hidden supplies, closing off the crossing zones. And so Apache Snow was one more operation like that. I mean, the intent was to search the area, to discover the hidden supply caches, to identify potential crossing points that have been concealed, because the North Vietnamese have gotten very good at that. They've gotten very good at creating these little highways, which in some cases you could actually drive trucks on, that were invisible from the air. because they would conceal them with overhanging tree branches and things, of that sort. So sometimes the only way you could find these things was to literally be on the ground and to physically, step through a screen of trees, and suddenly you're on this uh, road that it's reinforced with bamboo, and it's got concealment over the top. So sometimes you have to literally be on the ground. So that's the intent of this operation. The Allied intelligence uh, is giving information to the commanders that yes, there's um, potentially several North Vietnamese units in the valley, but they don't know exactly where they are. They're not even clear on what their current strength is. So they know, yes, potentially there may be 2 or 3 North Vietnamese regiments somewhere in the Ashau, but not necessarily where you're going. And we don't even know if you'll encounter them, because sometimes the North Vietnamese decide, look, it's not worth fighting for that area because it's not important to them, or they don't have enough food or ammunition. So you can never be sure. So going into this, there were no particular expectations that there was going to be, either a huge battle or that 937, that particular hill, was going to be the focal point. Because when the Americans are coming in, the 3rd Brigade of the 101st, they're landing 3 battalions at different areas in that central region. So the Rakasans, the 3rd Battalion 187, they're landing in the middle portion on or near Hill 937. Then you've got 2 other battalions, one landing to the north, one landing to the south, and even a South Vietnamese battalion landing farther to the north. So you have a string of these units, and it's not clear how much action they'll see or where the action is going to take place. So that's something to keep in mind. These 3rd Battalion 187 soldiers, when they landed, they were not going in thinking, oh my gosh, we're going to be in for the fight of our lives. It was, okay, we're going to go and search and see what we see.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this was a typical, of operations in this area, because again, it'd been a few months since any Allied troops had been in that area. So what the Allies knew about it came from aerial reconnaissance, photographs, few, prisoners of war. So the intelligence was again kind of spotty. But the mission was to search the area, find those supply lines, uncover those hidden trails, and then follow up any action that takes place. And so this is one more of other types of operations that have taken place in the valley in the past. And they've been fighting in the valley, no question about it. But generally speaking, the North Vietnamese had never just put their foot down and fought for a place.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, when they'd been cornered, they'd been fought, and then they would, evade and flee. So the sort of fighting that had taken place in the valley, there had been periods of heavy contact, but generally speaking, these are fights that take place within a couple of hours or a day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did the Rakasans and Hill 937 become the focal point?
Well, the battalion commander of the 3rd of the 187th, Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt, he had flown over the area, in a helicopter. So he'd seen it himself, and he had chosen 937. Again, it's called Hill 937 for the elevation in meters above sea level. It also had a local place name, Dong Ngap Bia, which again, sort of the translation would be crouching beast. And it would be not known by the name that we know it until, of course, after the battle. So initially, it was just Hill 937. He had chosen that one because there was a place nearby where there was kind of a natural corridor going across this river into Laos. And he thought, well, 937, it's a big sort of dominating land feature in the area. So A, the enemy, if they're going to be anywhere, probably going to be there. And B, you always want to take the dominating landmass, right? So if the Rakasans took Hill 937, they could establish a fire base right there and survey all the surrounding terrain. So you always want to seize the high ground. So that's why I chose it, not because he had particular intel, but because it was the logical thing to do. Now, the North Vietnamese, they knew, I mean, they know how the Americans fight. They knew that that was likely going to be one of the landing zones. And so they were prepared. In fact, several weeks before the Rakasans actually land, North Vietnamese commanders had made a decision that they were going to choose this place in the valley for a major battle. So they assigned it to a unit which was just coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail after retraining in North Vietnam. So this was a fresh unit, the 29th PAVN. PAVN means People's Army of Vietnam, basically the North Vietnamese Army Regiment, the 29th NV8 Regiment. So it was at full strength. Most of the soldiers were in good health. You know, they hadn't come down with the malaria. They were fairly well fed. So they chose this place because they figured the Americans would land there. So before the Americans arrived, this unit, and again, a regiment, we're talking about 1,500 soldiers or so, they honeycombed the mountain with trenches and bunkers. And so they would dig into the mountain and create these A-frame bunkers. So if you can imagine, you're looking at the side of a hill and you dig in like a triangle. Mm-hmm. And you reinforce the ceiling with wood. And because you have that A shape, when the hill gets pounded by artillery or something, the ceiling won't collapse, right? If you had a flat ceiling, it's more likely to collapse on you, but an A-frame, it's more resistant. So they're building this all across the mountain. And the mountain is if you look at it from above, think of it like a starfish. You know, you sort of have a high central blob, and then you've got these arms that radiate. Mm-hmm. So think of it like a starfish. And so what they would do is they would also build bunkers on either side of the arms because they know how the Americans operate. And the Americans always come up the spine of any ridge, right? They don't walk on the sides of a slope. Mm-hmm. They go along the spine. So they're, again, anticipating American tactics. So again, this is, you know, a couple of weeks before the Americans even arrive, the North Vietnamese are digging in, and this is going to be a knockdown, you know, drag out fight of the type that doesn't usually happen in the war. But they have committed themselves, the entire regiment, and the intent is to attempt to destroy as many American soldiers, and potentially, you know, they want to wipe out at least one company, like totally annihilate it. So this is going to be, I mean, they're in for the duration, and this is meant to coincide also with the communists are having they're preparing this spring offensive across the country, but also importantly, the birthday of Ho Chi Minh is coming up, and so they want to fight this battle as a type of you know, commemorative effort to for Ho Chi Minh's birthday. So they've got all these sort of motivational reasons that this battle is going to take place, and this is going to be, like I said, this is going to be kind of a fight to the death.
Got it.
Yeah.
So we've got some really vivid first person storytelling from a soldier who was there with the Rakasans. But if you had to summarize those 11 days and what happened to that unit in particular, you know, how do you what's your elevator pitch for Hamburger Hill and the Rakasans?
I would say it was a battle that developed in stages. like I said, you might think of the first day, 10 May, when the Rakashans landed, as a kind of tabula rasa, a blank slate. They really weren't sure what was there, didn't know who was in the area, and were just trying to suss out the situation. And for the first couple of days, they begin to realize that there are North Vietnamese troops on the hill, but they're just not clear how many. It isn't until about the fourth or fifth day that they're trying to get to the top of the hill. They keep running into harder and harder resistance. They realize, holy smokes, this is like a little Iwo Jima that we're on. And if you're familiar with the battle from World War II, the Japanese soldiers that honeycombed, Mount, Suribachi in Iwo Jima, it was like that. They realized they're everywhere and they're dug in, and they actually outnumber the Americans. I mean, again, this is an American battalion. It putting into the field, I mean, their full strength would be around 920 soldiers, but the amount of soldiers that you would actually put on the ground is usually closer, it would be closer to maybe 700 or 800.
Mm.
And so when the battle begins, in fact, the Americans are basically outnumbered 2-1. And they're fighting an enemy that are well dug in, well prepared, concealed. So, I mean, all the advantages are on the North Vietnamese side.
Mm.
And it takes the Americans about 4 or 5 days to realize just what a terrible situation they're in. But Colonel Honeycutt is determined, to take the hill from the enemy. I mean, once the battle is joined, I'm not sure what else you can do, other than ask for reinforcements, which he does. And as the battle goes on, more troops join the battle. They come from various directions. So by the very end, you actually have 4 Allied battalions attacking from 4 directions at once. But the fact is that once the battle is joined, it was just about impossible to leave. Some people have said afterward, like, why would you keep attacking up a hill, 10 days in a row, day after day, even though you're facing, terrible odds, even though you're exposed, even though, you're using all your airstrikes, artillery, to pound those positions, but the enemy's so well dug in, it's not having much of an effect. I mean, why not just leave the hill, right? Just leave the hill and let B-52s, turn it upside down.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the, the what ifs you hear. Well, that was never an option. And Colonel Honeycutt knew that, because it's very difficult to extract your soldiers once they're in contact. The Rakashans only had one small landing zone that they could get, only get a 1 or 2 choppers in at any one time. So it would have been nearly impossible to actually get the battalion off the hill with those helicopters, because once you start doing that, the enemy realizes what you're doing, and then they converge on you. And you can't just walk off the hill, because even at this point, the Americans don't know what else is down in the valley. Mm-hmm. I mean, they have to be concerned, what if there's another NVA regiment right across the river, waiting for the Americans to come off that hill.
Right.
So, I mean, you have to understand, their thinking. And also you have to get at least 6 kilometers away to be safe enough from a B-52 strike. And if you got that far away, oh, well, North Vietnamese know what's coming. Like, if you skedaddle, they know what's coming, and they would simply go back to Laos.
Right.
So at any rate, the point is, once the battle was joined, you had to keep fighting. And I think that's the core takeaway, is that, with the Rakashans really doing, the most fighting from the beginning, the only way out was up. The only way to resolve this battle was to take the hill. It wasn't, stupidity. It wasn't even, vainglorious, ego. Although, I mean, once you're involved, I mean, you don't want to just pass it off to someone else, right? And Colonel Honeycutt knew this was going to be a battle for the ages. He knew this was going to be a defining fight for the Rakashans for all future time, which it has become, right?
Yeah.
And so his orders, were to, take that hill. So everything that he did in those 10 days was to accomplish the mission, and obviously to do it in a way that would preserve the lives of as many of his soldiers as possible. But it was, I think this is an example of just, absolute determination, valor, resilience. That's the takeaway. It should be, remembered as an example where, the American soldier is at his finest.
Got
And
it.
when they finally do get to the top of the hill, after 10, 11 days, um, they have accomplished the mission. They've more or less destroyed the 29th Regiment in the process, right? The casualties, I mean, they're different, estimates, but at least 650 are killed, and at least as many are wounded. So effectively, 80% of the regiment is either dead or wounded. So this is a new regiment. They spent it, 6 or 9 months rebuilding, and boom, it's gone. And that's important,
What were the
because
casualties on our side?
well, because by taking out the 29th Regiment, what they did was they took out really the one effective communist unit in the valley. There were one or two other regiments in the valley, but they were really beat up. So the commies didn't have much offensive power. This was it,
Mhm.
and by destroying it, that meant it was going to be another 4 or 6 or even 8 months before the communists could bring back that type of power. And again, this is all about buying time, right?
Sure.
So taking the hill, yes, it's true. It's not about that hill per se. Although, again, this is a point to really make. Unlike some of what you've heard about this battle, the Americans did not abandon the hill. The Rakasans were pulled out because they had sustained so many killed and wounded. So yes, the Rakasans were pulled out, but other units from the 101st stayed. And indeed, the Americans completed a road that extended all the way from the lowlands around Way up through the mountains into the valley up to the top of Hill 937. And that road was strong and well built enough to sustain tanks. So they actually put M48 tanks on top of Hill 937, facing towards Laos, and kept them there through the summer. So they did not abandon the hill. The hill was actually important in a tactical sense because, like I said, it dominated the surrounding terrain. If the point was to close off the access routes in the central part of the valley, like the one part that we hadn't done that yet, now we did it.
Mhm.
We stayed there throughout the summer. And by holding Hill 937, again, that gave the Allies the ability to dominate the whole Central Valley. And so it's simply not true that we abandoned the hill. Now, when the monsoon rains come back in, late summer, the weather turns bad, the Allies do withdraw. But because it's the monsoon season, it's also very, very hard for the enemy to do anything, right?
Right, right.
So, you have accomplished the mission. You've bought another 6 or 9 months,
Sure, sure.
that now the enemy cannot effectively use the valley. And that was the point from the beginning. And like I said, getting back to my original point, this is what the American strategy was in 69. How can we use our military power, as long as we have it, to help the South Vietnamese, prepare for the long haul? And so these operations in the Asha Valley, taking Hill 937, staying there the summer, these were all important measures that bought time for our allies. And that's what it was about, because we knew we were going to start heading out the door. Now, again,
Mhm.
that process takes a few years, not overnight, but the thinking behind this whole campaign and the fight on the Hill was about that. It was about buying time, and in that sense, it was mission accomplished. It absolutely was mission accomplished.
Got it. So I've got two more questions for you. Well,
Yeah.
actually three, two short ones and a long one. The first short one is, can you talk about the cost in terms of American casualties, and
Right.
particularly to the Rakkasans?
So uh, oddly there's still some debate over the exact number of killed, and there's also one could make a distinction between the casualties which took place in and around Hill 937 versus there were several other fights that took place elsewhere in the valley during this time where North Vietnamese troops attacked American landing zones. So there was casualties and fighting elsewhere. So it depends if you look at the campaign, you look at the Hill. However, at the very least, Hill 937, you're talking at least American killed in the mid 50s. And you had up to 400 wounded. Not all those were requiring evacuation, but
Mhm.
injuries of some sort. And that's a big chunk if you're talking, the better part of 3 battalions. Those are pretty significant numbers. Um, the Rakkasans got the brunt of it because they were in from the beginning and got the worst of the action. Uh, this is part of the reason they get flown out at the end. It's not that they couldn't fight, but they were pretty beat up, pretty disorganized. I mean, these are guys who are getting maybe 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night and are doing this for 10 days, plus being shot at, plus they're going from having some pretty cool evenings to getting downpours at various parts of the day. So they're going, they're soaked to the bone. They're starting to have like jungle rot on their feet. I mean, you know, apart from those who were like actually, killed or wounded, just everyone else was also completely
Suffering.
worn out.
Yeah.
But yeah, the casualties, it was, it was significant. It was not on the scale of North Vietnamese casualties, but in compared to a lot of the fighting that had been taking place, in this spring of '69, this was noteworthy. I mean, you don't usually have battles that last more than a day. So one that lasts 10 days stands out. And then you, generally speaking, in any particular action, if you had 4 or 5 or 6 Americans killed in an action, that's significant. And that's heavy action for a unit. So suddenly you have, 56 killed,
Mhm.
400 wounded. I mean, the scale just jumps, to a whole nother level. And this is part of the reason that the battle got so much attention back home,
And its
right?
name,
It's
presumably.
because, at the end of the battle, apparently one of the paratroopers um, wrote on a sea ration box and stuck it on the top with his knife that said Hamburger Hill. Just a a name for this just meat grinder
Mhm.
type of action. Now, American troops had given places names like that in the past, like you have Pork Chop Hill, in Korea and places like that. But um, that little sea ration sign, on top of the hill, and there's actually a photo of it. It just stuck. So, since then we've thought of the battle as Hamburger Hill, just because for this the scale, the casualties, and I think at the time too, there was just back home, some folks were like, "What is going on?" Again, there were a lot of people who believed we were on the verge of being withdrawal, thought that the war was you know beginning to settle down a little bit, and suddenly you have this 10-day fight, and I think combine that with the catchy title Hamburger Hill, and suddenly you have folks at home asking new questions or asking old questions in a more heated way. What are
Got it.
we doing here?
Okay. So the next short question, if you could just sort of very briefly, just so I have it, um, talk about the history of the Rakkasans and the legacy of the Rakkasans,
Yeah.
and even what the where the name comes from.
Yeah. So the uh, the 187th Infantry um, Regiment in World War II fought in the Pacific and fought as a part of the 17th Airborne Division. So fought in places like the Philippines and did combat jumps and saw a lot of action. And when the war ends, the Rakkasans, the 187th Infantry, as they were known then, they form part of the occupation army in Japan. And so they are stationed in Japan for a number of years. And it's during that time that they are there in Japan that the local Japanese citizens give them their nickname, Rakkasan, which means umbrella men, because they're parachutists. So they're seeing them, parachute from the sky, and the symbol of the parachute. And so they call them that, and the 187th Infantry soldiers take on that nickname. And in fact, to this day, their sort of unit symbol is the Tori, which is the Shinto shrine that the red wood, that we the two legs and then the two crossbars. And so the if you go to Fort Campbell and see where the Rakkasans are based, you'll see gigantic Tories all over there, and literally like physical ones and on the walls. And so they really embrace that. So that's where the name comes from. And the Rakkasans fought in Korea. In fact, the commander of the Rakkasans at one point was a certain William Westmoreland, who again goes on to become the MACV commander, right? And then in 1969, Westmoreland is chief of staff of the Army. So there's a connection there, and it's in Korea that a young officer with the last name of Honeycutt is serving with the Rakkasans and executes this really audacious mission on behalf of the regimental commander, Westmoreland, Colonel Westmoreland. And Westmoreland is so impressed with Honeycutt, he gets the nickname Tiger at this point, and it's sort of given him by Westmoreland. That he sort of Westmoreland, now has an eye on this young hard charger. And in years later, when I think this was at West Point, when they met a number of years later, Westmoreland basically says, okay, my call sign back in the day was given to me by General John J. Pershing, who is nicknamed Blackjack. So Westmoreland had used that call sign. He says that is now yours. So Weldon Honeycutt is that is his call sign, Blackjack.
So
So
it went
he's
from
sort of
Pershing
there's
to
this
Westmoreland.
handing down of tradition from Pershing to Westmoreland to Honeycutt.
Mm.
Right. And so again, this is part of like the storied history of the Rakkasans, the sense of history and continuity. I think that's was also on Colonel Honeycutt's mind when they're fighting that hill. It's
And
like
what did
there's
it?
no way we're going to back down.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so, what did it come to mean after
Well,
Hamburger Hill?
it's now a defining part of the unit's legacy. The Rakkasans, there's the first and the third brigade now. They're no longer operate as a full regiment.
Hmm.
The Army's kind of changed, but the third of the 187th, still embody that tradition. They have reunions every year now, where the veterans of Hamburger Hill come to Fort Campbell, and they honor them. They have several days ceremony and events, and today's Rakkasans get to meet the Rakkasans of yesteryear. Not just Hamburger Hill, but the veterans of Vietnam War. And so the Rakkasans have really maintained that tradition. So every soldier who becomes a Rakkasan knows the story of Hamburger Hill. They know what it meant to be there. They know what it means to the soldiers now, part of their identity. They get to meet and talk with these guys who are there. Colonel Honeycutt, comes out every year. It's that passing of the torch that I think Rock Sons have just done so well. So it's just a part of it's a part of their identity now.
Got it. Okay, last question. This one might take a bit, but
Mhm.
there's been some activity in recent years or more recent decades, to get some decorations that were earned but not received.
Right.
And I think that's a really compelling part of this story. Can you
Yeah.
kind of
So this
cover
this
that for
goes
us?
at least in part to in this tradition the Rock Sons have of honoring the Hamburger Hill veterans. And in 2019, for the 50th reunion, it's a big deal. I was invited by the then battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Martin Bowling, who spent well over a year before that preparing for this. He wanted to make it a really big deal, really do it properly. So he asked me to come out as a Vietnam War historian and talk to both the veterans who assembled and their families and the current Rock Sons about Hamburger Hill, and to address some questions I think that were still outstanding, like the question of like, did we actually abandon the hill? And what was the point of it? Did it any of it make a difference? And so I answered some of those questions. But Colonel Bowling, in doing this, he went a whole several steps beyond. At the end of the reunion, he actually went back to Vietnam with about a dozen of these Hamburger Hill veterans and a number of his soldiers, and they went to Hill 937, and they actually climbed to the top of it. And most of those guys who went on that trip had never gotten to the top because they had been wounded, before the end of the battle. And so it was incredibly meaningful, trip. They also got to meet with some of the former North Vietnamese, including the North Vietnamese battalion commander, who had been in charge of the defenses on that hill. So they had a chance to actually meet their former enemies, climb to the top of the hill, and just share stories. And out of all of that, Colonel Bowling came to realize, the more he investigated this, that a number of those soldiers had never received the decorations that they were due. And really the short answer, the reason why that is the casualties were so great during the battle that the normal process broke down, right? Because you have to, if the soldier to be, you have to nominate a soldier, right? And then you have to have a person provide testimony. You have to have the commander or an officer write up, the proper paperwork, and then get it sent forward. But so many people had been killed or wounded, that process broke down. So what happened is, in some cases, the paper was put in, but it was never finalized. Or in some cases, it was, it was done later on, but there was something wrong. There was like missing elements because the person who was trying to get the paper through hadn't actually been there. So bottom line is, a number of these soldiers never received the decorations, and Colonel Bowling took it on himself to make that right. And so he has been successful already in several cases of getting those awards to those soldiers. In fact, there was an event down in South Carolina about 14, 16 months ago, where they had dignitaries come out, and the soldier was there, and they gave him the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart that he had earned but never received. So this is something
And this was in South Carolina instead of Fort Campbell.
Colonel Bowling is now doing because he thinks it's the right thing to do, not because he's
The reason this particular ceremony took place in South Carolina, just want to be clear, instead of Fort Campbell, is because that's where the soldiers.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Colonel Bowling is going to where these veterans live.
Got it.
Yeah, and so this soldier happened to be down in South Carolina, and he's like, that let's go honor them there where all their friends are,
Mhm.
where they've chosen to live, um, and um, and so he is kind of embarked on this crusade to make things right, and not because the army says that he needs to do it, but he just feels like it's the right thing to do, and those that ceremony and that week of events, I think just made such a profound impression on him and everyone else. They thought this, even 50 years later, we can still do things to help our veterans, to help our Vietnam veterans, to do more than simply, slap on a bumper sticker. Just go a little bit extra. And you can achieve a lot. You can do something that's going to have real meaning for that person and their family. And so that's what he's doing.
Yeah, and for the legacy of that unit.
For absolutely. And I think this is an important thing the Army is, I'm seeing is actually starting to work on. I know as a historian, I'm personally involved in this effort now, which is to imbue history and heritage throughout the Army in a meaningful way. And one way to do that are events like this, where you bring the veterans together with the current soldiers, and you have those talks and those relationships grow, so that soldiers now understand what it means to be a part of that unit. And it's not just a pop quiz from a history book. I mean, it's like that guy that you met,
Mhm.
at the convention, who showed you, the award that he had earned, or the photos he had taken, or the stories that he had lived through. And I think that's how we build a better Army, but that's how we honor veterans.
Yeah.
And that process, uh, you know, we have got a long way to go to get where we need to be, but I think we're starting to move in that direction.
Well, what have we not talked about, specific to Hamburger Hill? What have I not asked you that you
Yeah,
feel like we
I
should,
think
cover?
the probably the one thing that does get brought up is, and I alluded to, is kind of the reaction back home, because while the battle was going on, for the first part of the battle, there were no army photographers there or reporters, and so it was late in the sort of later phase of the battle that a journalist finally did go out to the hill to observe. And so some of the photos and reporting that came back, again, came to the attention of people in Congress. And so there was a speech by Ted Kennedy, for example, where Ted Kennedy, the Democrat from Massachusetts, pointed to the reporting of this battle and saying, "What is going on here? Why are we, trying to seize this particular piece of ground at such grievous cost to ourselves, when no one can tell me why that particular hill means anything? Right? Why are we doing that now, when everyone who has eyes can see that we're, going to begin to extricate ourselves from Vietnam? When all the signs are pointing in that direction, why are we still pursuing these you know, quote unquote search and destroy tactics? Why are we out in these remote parts of the jungle fighting for hills that don't matter? I mean, how is that, advancing our cause? And so he was using this battle as just a example, just to make a point about our larger policy, which is, are we actually trying to wind this war down or not? And so that particular short, is actually a pretty short statement that he made. Of course, got a lot of people talking, because some folks shared his view or shared his puzzlement. Others came to the defense of, say, the division commander, the 101st, General Zase, and said, and including people in Congress, and said, well, okay, so here's why he was doing what he was doing. And it's even at the time, they sort of gave, some of the reasons that I provided why this operation was taking place. But I think what it did was this battle and then the controversy that it generated really just highlighted where the discussion about the war was at this stage. It had kind of become, divided into either, no one, in other words, no one thought we were going to win the war at this point. The question was, how are we going to withdraw from it? And the folks on the Ted Kennedy side were basically the feeling of, look, the way we do this is to get as few Americans killed as possible, right? Let's get out as quickly as we can with the fewest Americans killed. I mean, that was their point of view. And then the folks on the other side, took the position, okay, even if we are going to begin pulling out, let's do it the right way. Let's do it in a way that's going to allow the South Vietnamese a fighting chance, right? So that all this time and effort that we spent on the war isn't for naught. And therefore, that's where you've got to say, okay, it's the commanders on the ground, let them do their thing. They know what they're doing. They're trying to accomplish that mission. And so that's kind of where, I think it just highlighted that divide. And this is, again, a month before President Nixon publicly announces the start of withdrawal. So this is taking place just a month before he makes that announcement. It just shows you that we are now sort of, as a nation, at a point where everyone kind of recognizes, no, we're not going to win in a conventional sense. We know that. But the question is, how do we get out of the war?
Mm-hmm.
And they just kind of highlighted the difference between those, we said, let's just get out as quickly as we can, save as many Americans as we can, versus those who said, look, it's going to take a while, if we're going to let the South Vietnamese, have a fighting chance. And that's kind of really what the controversy, I think, highlighted at the time. And even now, it's a valid question. Some people can, again, they can quibble about the tactics used in the battle. But, I think everyone on either side both recognizes that, just the lives lost, both, Vietnamese and American. You never want to become numb to that. You never want that to simply just become numbers. If you have your humanity, and you have to always recognize the cost. And so the debate of was the cost worth it? Ultimately, this going to come down to an individual choice. I can't tell you. I can tell you why they did it. I can tell you what the effects probably were in a, military history sense, but, was it worth it for that person? That's a personal choice. And I'm not going to tell anyone how to think about that.
Sure. Well, because that battle is so famous, anybody who may be learning about it for the first time is pretty likely to find out pretty quickly that there's also a famous motion picture called Hamburger Hill.
Yeah.
For people who haven't seen it, including me, I haven't seen it. What guidance do you have for us if we're inclined to go watch that film? What should we know?
I would say, if you're really serious about kind of having a learning experience, I would say just do a little bit of prep before you watch the movie. Either listen to this podcast, or you can, in fact, download and read, the official after action reports if you should choose to do so. Again, not particularly long reads, pretty easy to get through. Just do a little bit of research, because then I think when you watch the film, you'll be able to engage with it on different levels. So you can look at it like, okay, from a dramatic point of view, is this a good film? Like, does it tell a good story? But then you can also be like a historian nitpicker and go, oh, I know that didn't happen. They didn't use that. Okay, you can play that game too, which is fun. I do it. But you can also say, another way to look at it is, well, what's the larger message of the film. What's the undercurrent? What am I left with? What is it trying to tell me? And honestly, that's how we should engage all of our media sources. I mean, just take this as an example of how you should watch any movie, or read any newspaper article. Is to ask questions, is to like try to pull it apart a little bit, right? Don't just take it at face value. Just because it's a Hollywood movie doesn't mean it's right,
Mm.
right? Doesn't mean it's wrong. But just engage with it. I guess that's what I'm saying. Do a little research ahead of time, and then look at it critically. We'd all be better off if we did that more often.
Sure. Yeah. And then, your more fact-based research
Yeah,
can enrich your enjoyment of the film, and vice versa. The
right.
film can then enrich, your understanding of
Yeah.
of what actually
And
happened.
then, like in some cases too. I mean, I've worked on some documentaries and some Hollywood features, and there is such a thing as dramatic license,
Sure.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
you can't you do a
They're not making documentaries,
right,
right?
exactly.
I
You don't
mean,
have a minute by minute recreation of everything that ever. So sometimes you compress certain episodes, or sometimes you use one person, which kind of incorporates elements of several people. I mean, that'll happen, and that's part of the art form.
mhm.
Doesn't make it a bad film. It just means if you're aware of what's going on, then it's a richer experience, I think, for you. It's more interesting because you see how the sausage has been made.
Yeah. Yeah, and you recognize the artistic license and
Yeah,
those
and the
decisions, and
artistic
you
license. In some
and you
cases, you're like,
understand
oh,
why.
that was shrewd.
Right.
I know that's like a beautiful way. A 15-second image which convey like a whole thing.
Yeah.
You could have spent 2 hours on.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.